In this video, we jump into Chapter 11 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff with Capitalism is the Only Moral Social System. Stay tuned. So let's start out with a summary, and first we get an introduction to the chapter. And here, what Leonard gives us is an explanation of the relationship between politics and economics. Politics names the principles that guide proper social organization, and then economics investigates how such a society functions in the realm of production and trade. What Leonard gives us, or is going to give us, is not an economics lesson or even the full economic case for capitalism, but rather what he calls a philosophic analysis of capitalism. What philosophic and moral principles does the capitalist system embody, and what therefore must be the effect of the system on man's life. We also get a claim that the economic, and you could add historic, case for capitalism has been established by the classical economists and Austrian economists, and that though these are flawed in various ways, Leonard thinks that's not why capitalism is perishing. He says it's perishing from the absence of a rational philosophy. This absence alone explains why the abundance of economic answers offered to our century by a better past has been ignored by the world and will go on being ignored. So we're going to get three sections. The first is going to integrate economics and ethics. The second is going to integrate economics and epistemology. And then we'll see the deepest explanation for the opposition against capitalism in the final section. So then, turning to capitalism as the only moral social system, capitalism, Leonard says, is the social system based on individual rights, including property rights, and that this entails a total separation of state and economics. And the way he puts it is that men act and interact voluntarily by individual choice and free trade. He stresses that we've never had pure capitalism, never had a system that fully separates state and economics, but we've approximated it in the West, particularly in 19th century America. So what is the moral case for capitalism? It's that rights subordinate society to moral law. They liberate human beings from force and thus allow us to live rationally. Capitalism protects our freedom to think and to act accordingly, and thereby allows us to live. Most of the chapter then is concretizing this claim by looking at the 6 derivative virtues and the principle of egoism. And I'm not going to go through all that, though I'll say some things about it in a minute. When we then end with a discussion of why it's crucial to validate capitalism on a proper moral basis. Especially, we get that Leonard rejects any attempt to justify capitalism by appealing to the public good. And he argues that if you make the public good your standard of value, then individual freedom becomes what he calls an ethically neutral means to this end, or after Kant, a necessary evil. Capitalism's virtue in this interpretation is that it converts the amorality of prudence or the wickedness of greed into the nobility of social work. But if that's your vision of capitalism, then he thinks you won't be able to actually grasp the causality of how capitalism promotes human life. And so you'll ultimately have to compromise and sell out capitalism. So that if self-sacrifice is the moral way to live, then you can't maintain a perspective that says we flourish by unleashing selfishness. All right, so I'm going to actually be pretty brief on my analysis this time because Yaron and I wrote a whole book on this free market revolution about a moral case for capitalism. But I will say a few things. So first of all, I think it's important to get what Ayn Rand is even doing in her moral defense of capitalism. Because you might think that what it is, well, look, everybody agrees on what capitalism is and how it functions. And then she's just saying, well, I think selfishness is good, therefore capitalism is good. And other people say, no, I think selfishness is bad, therefore I think capitalism is bad. Like, that's not at all the way it works. And notice that's not the way it works in morality. So if you think about Ayn Rand's argument in morality, it's not the conventional view of selfishness is right, but I think it's good and you think it's bad. It's that the whole way of thinking about what selfishness is wrong. That they think selfishness is irrational, short-range, whim-driven, people at each other's throats. And her view is that no, it's rational, long-range, value-creating, and mutually beneficial relationships with human beings where nobody sacrifices to anybody. And that it's once you conceptualize what selfishness is in the right way, then there's not even really a special problem of getting that it's good. That it's good flows right out of seeing that it's pro-human life, and that it's a victimless way of existence. So it's not just pro my life, it's pro everybody's life. And so there's no actual grounds for thinking, well, yeah, okay, so capitalism or selfishness is good for me and it's good for everybody else, and I'm against it. Like that's not how it works. And it's the same in capitalism. So it's true that people will bring in standards of evaluation that are anti-capitalist, like on the face of it. So if you're an egalitarian who says what we want is equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, and one person shouldn't be able to enjoy their success because it makes us less equal, then yeah, you could have a conclusion that capitalism leads to incredible prosperity, but because it leads to inequality, it's bad. Or you could be an environmentalist who says, yeah, capitalism leads to all this kind of wealth and everything, but my whole goal is not to impact the planet, so I think it's bad. But notice that even in those cases where the standard of evaluation is openly at odds with capitalism and with freedom, that is not the argument that's made. In all of those cases, it's that, yeah, take the environmentalist case. Yeah, they'll admit capitalism does create a lot of wealth today, but in the long run, it's unsustainable and basically the world's going to fall apart. Or if you take the egalitarian one, it's that they'll tie increasing inequality to every sort of problem. This is something Yaron and I talk about in Equals Unfair. They don't just say, yeah, everybody would be better off, but we'd have a lot of inequality. It's that, no, that inequality would make us all worse off. So there's a way in which a standard of evaluation has behind it a causal picture of human beings, of human life, of human society. And that what you need is, in order to persuade people and persuade a culture to embrace a certain kind of policy or social system or ethics for that matter, it's that you need both. You need a correct standard of value and then the causal picture that entails that standard of value. And so what Ayn Rand is doing in her understanding of capitalism is saying, well, let me step back. So how is capitalism actually talked about? Well, the basic model is that human beings are selfish in the conventional sense. Short range, irrational, at each other's throats, lie, cheating, and stealing is what's good for you. And that we have to restrain that in order to keep us from destroying each other, destroying ourselves, in order to create a moral society. And so that entails a regulatory state to say, no, look, you can't let your self-interest run rampant. And then it entails a redistributive state that says, look, it's callous and cold that you should be out there prospering from your business, and there's people who are struggling to pay their rent. We have to put that to an end. And so Ayn Rand's, what you can think of her as doing is arguing that, yes, capitalism does unleash and reward selfishness, but not in the conventional sense. In my sense, in the sense of rational, long-term, productive, non-sacrificial relationships with other human beings. That's what's unleashed. That's what's protected. And that's why I say that capitalism is good. Capitalism is good because it allows the individual to live rationally, to live a rationally selfish life. And that's really what the moral case is. Now, that's the core of the moral case. But like that alone is not enough. What you have to be able to do is use that basic framework to clarify the history of capitalism, the economics of capitalism, the major industries, major policy kinds of questions, how to how that should frame legal thinking. It's that you need that philosophic framework then to shape people's whole conceptualization of the system, of the world, of the alternatives. And so that's really the project. It's not like you just give somebody OPAR and then they'll become pro-capitalist, although, that can happen. It's that this is the framework then that must be brought to bear on a whole range of issues in order for people to see the world through that lens, a lens of understanding what selfishness is and understanding, therefore, why it's good. And so that's the real work. The work is, now that we have this incredible framework for understanding capitalism, helping people grasp the framework and see how it applies. And part of that is stripping away myths, right? Because so much of what happens is that I don't need to think about whether capitalism is a moral system because I have a whole bunch of knee-jerk responses. What about the poor? What about the Great Depression? What about the financial crisis? Like, there's a million of these, what about climate change? And so they have a whole bunch of knee-jerk reactions that permit them not to consider capitalism, not to consider the value of freedom. And what there has to be is that there has to be a real account of all of these things. And thankfully, and this is part of what Leonard points out, is many of these things have been at least semi-addressed before Ayn Rand ever came along, or at least in fields where Ayn Rand didn't really, focus, like in economics and everything. But that all of that has to be corrected, but it has to be corrected from a right philosophic framework, and the framework itself has to be promoted. And so that's really what goes into grasping that capitalism is the moral social system, and then persuading people that capitalism is the moral social system. So again, for more on that, see my books and see the work I've done on persuasion, where I talk a lot about like the freedom, pro-freedom versus the anti-freedom frameworks, and how we can inject that into our communication in order to win hearts and minds for free markets and for capitalism. That's it for this video. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit that bell so you get alerts whenever we post new material. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.